Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on achieving just energy transition in India's coal mining region, participatory governance, and the role of the state. Organized by the International Institute for Sustainable Development and Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, I extend a warm welcome to all of you for joining from various corners of the globe. My name is Deepak Sharma, and I'm a policy analyst with ISD based out of New Delhi. ISD is an independent think tank having offices across the world. We have been operating in India for more than a decade. ISD works on issues of energy and sustainable development. We have been tracking government support to various energy technologies and support the national and state government in their effort to shift support from fossil fuels to clean energy in a just and socially responsible way. Now, coming back to the topic on achieving just energy transition in India's coal mining region, participatory governance, and the role of state. This topic is both timely and relevant, considering the role of coal in India's economy and the people dependent on it. I would like to now announce a few housekeeping rules before I hand over today's session to the moderator. This session is being recorded and will be available on ISD's official YouTube channel. The link of the channel will be posted in the chat box. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with your colleagues. We also welcome your comments and questions. Please see the Q&A box and the comment box on your screen. Please share your comments in the comment box. And if you have a question, I would encourage you to post those questions at any time during the webinar, and our moderator will pick these up. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please specify that as well. I'm now going to hand over the session to the moderator of the event, Dr. Roona Sarkar, professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, to start the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepak. You've set the context for the discussions today already. And on behalf of the Center for Development and Environment Policy, IIM Calcutta's Bridge Initiative, that is the Building Roadmaps for Industrial Decarbonization and Greening Economy Initiative, a very, very warm welcome to all the participants and the panelists in today's session. You are all part of the third in a series of 4 webinars to present to you the salient outcomes of a year-long effort of around 57 researchers and policy practitioners who came together to bring out their contributions in an edited volume titled The Role of Coal in a Sustainable Energy Mix for India, a Wide-Angle View. This book will be published by Routledge as an open access book sometime in September, early September, and Deepak has kindly provided the link for the book for all of you in the audience. So what we've done is in each webinar, we've picked up one section of the book and discussed the themes around it. Today, we are going to be talking about lessons from the second section of the book, which deals with two distinct but interrelated themes. One which talks about the policies and policy frameworks that would shape the aspects of a transition which is just and fair, and the other which looks at institutional governance issues in this process. The section itself has 5 chapters and 4 independent boxes or appendices, authored by around 16 contributors from national and international institutions, and that made it really hard for us to identify 4 panelists of this illustrious group of 16. I'm very grateful to the 4 panelists who chose or who agreed to join us today. But I must also ask you to look at the 5th chapter, which is authored by Sarthak Shukla and Raghav Pachauri. And what they talk about is the state of play of India's current policies in the context of energy transition. So it's a very, very interesting chapter, and I urge all of you to look at it once the open access book is out. Before I introduce our speakers, just, a disclaimer, if you will. All the views expressed in this discussion are the views or our personal views and should not be attributed to the institutions that every person belongs to. So just with that disclaimer, let me go ahead and introduce my panelists, my speakers, and I'll do so in reverse order. So I start out with Ms. Vibhuti Garg. Vibhuti has been kind enough to agree to wrap our session up. So she will provide us concluding comments. And she is the Director, South Asia with the Institute for Energy, Economics and Financial Analysis. And she has been working on promoting sustainable development through influencing policy interventions, whether it is on energy pricing, adopting new technologies, subsidy reform, enhancing clean energy, access to capital, private participation, all areas within the energy sector. We very much look forward to her closing remarks. And, as I'm continuing in reverse order, the next person I'd want to introduce is Ms. Vinuta Gopal. She's the founder and CEO of Asar Social Impact Advisors Private Limited and recipient of the Climate Breakthrough Award 2022. And she will provide us a bottom-up view of energy transition, specifically from the context of marginalized communities who are dependent on coal. As is evident from her award, she's been working on environment and social justice issues now very effectively for over 2 decades. Another thing that the audience must have noticed is that this panel is quite different in terms of its gender balance. And in that context, I am very, very happy to introduce you to Mr. Simran Grover, the founder and CEO of the Center for Energy, Environment and People, and which is an initiative for energy equity and climate justice. And, as the only gentleman in this panel, we congratulate your bravery and thank you for being a part of this. Simran has been working to promote constitutional values and democratic processes in the domain of energy and climate governance, and I'm sure we will hear some of those ideas through our discussion today. Ms. Madhura Joshi, Senior Associate and India Energy Transition Lead with E3G, will share with us lessons from international experiences on just energy transition planning. She has a decade's experience, or more than a decade's experience, working in the energy and climate policy in India and the Global South. And we are looking forward to hear from her. And of course, we are going to start our discussion with Professor Shaun Rai, who is an economist specializing in industry and international trade issues. And her specific areas of interest include the global value chain, technological upgrading of Indian industry, free trade agreements, trade creation effects, technology transfer, FDIs, financial inclusion, and all of this in the context of climate change. Today, she will talk about her chapter, which is about on the policy space and decarbonization in the context of Industry 2.0. So over to you, Shaun. Your chapter has some very, very interesting insights. The first being the emergence of industrial policy once again as a tool for planners and development as such, both in the developing and developed world. And in this context, the reassessment of industrial policy reveals past successes that were previously underestimated. So could you provide some examples of these successful episodes, particularly in the context of sustainable development and decarbonization? And, could you suggest then some key takeaways that we could use to shape current and future policy decisions in the context of a fair energy transition? Over to you, Shaun.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. So, industrial policy, in fact, is not new. It's just that we've just had a resurgence of interest in industrial policy. So industrial policy, what is industrial policy? It's basically a set of policies that selectively favors development of certain industries over others. And obviously here the role of the state is very critical because it is going to extend, it addresses the problems associated with industrial policy, basically the issue of market failure, and it shapes and helps create new markets. Now, industrial policy, of course, has been used for a long time, and there are these conventional industrial policies and various examples of that also, for example, from countries like France, Japan, South Korea. But what is new currently is the focus on green industrial policy. So basically favoring the green sectors or promoting green goods or industries, or maybe producing goods which have lower emissions. Now, in that context, again, there are many examples, and we can draw lessons from that. So basically, green industrial policy actually requires even more careful attention than conventional industrial policy from the state. And to promote the decarbonization efforts. Now, there are various examples of even green industrial policy that we see, and particularly from the developing South, there are these examples. For example, in the case of photovoltaics, solar photovoltaics in China, the renewable energy sector in China, electric mobility in China. But stepping away from the Chinese examples, there are other examples as well. From Brazil, for example, we have the examples of solar thermal panels. We've had the ethanol policy that Brazil had, very successful, in fact. Coming to the Indian case, also, we've had a few successes. One of the prominent successes would be the case of the CNG for Delhi's autos. But in recent times, we've also had, there are examples of the wind turbine case in the context of India, and also the EV transition that is happening right now. Though it is quite early, but then it seems to be a step in the right direction. So what are the sort of pitfalls to look out for, or what are the things that policy should be addressing? Main thing is that the problem of market failure, how that can be addressed. And there are two criticisms of industrial policy. Those need to be addressed. One is that, the problem of the information asymmetry that is associated with such policy, and the problem of corruption. So both of these things need to be addressed, but we can come back to that in the subsequent discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Ray. So Shaun's given us an overview of the goods and the bads of industrial policy, and also given us some very interesting examples in the Indian context. You also touched upon some of the international experiences from the point of view of technology policy. Madhura, if I may now lean on you to build a little further on this and maybe talk to us about international experiences in the context of decarbonization. Because for sure it is clear that going forward, coal phase down is something that we have to embrace in the Indian context. And there are various countries around the world which have already to some extent moved forward in this energy transition. What are the lessons that we can pick up from those countries? And how can we apply them in the context of India as such?
Thank you so much, Luna. Good morning, everyone. And thank you to IIST and IIM CEEP for inviting me to speak and giving me this opportunity. So I just wanted to sort of highlight a few statistics before I begin with examples to sort of also show why we say that coal phase down and fossil fuel phase down is going to be inevitable. We know that the window to restrict global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius is rapidly narrowing. And the World Meteorological Organization's report from earlier this year was quite chilling. It sort of projects that the world is likely to breach 1.5 Celsius threshold by 2027, at least temporarily. And already we are seeing raging impacts of climate change. This year alone has seen world record-breaking temperature highs. While Europe and North Africa were burning, Asia was ravaged by floods, parts of India were also flooded. So what do the sort of scenarios tell us? IPCC's 1.5 no or limited overshoot pathway shows that coal is likely to decline or should decline by 95%, oil by 60%, and gas by 45% compared to 2019 levels by 2050. Even under the 2-degree or below scenario, low carbon sources produce 93 to 97% of the global electricity by 2050. So we know that phase down has to take place. On coal specifically, what has been the progress so far? Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, global pre-construction coal project pipeline has contracted by 72%, which is really good news. Only 9 countries sort of account for 93% of the global coal capacity, planned global coal capacity, of which China accounts for 72%. But essentially, the writing is clear that reaching net zero will require phasing down all fossil fuels. However, past experiences of transitions in the scene across the world have not been sort of the best lessons. Multiple factors, looking at coal transitions specifically, multiple factors led to transitions: declining domestic demand, changes in relative prices of competing fuels, air pollution regulations, decreased competitiveness of domestic production, and lower productivity gains. However, the policies that were developed or the reactions from a governance standpoint was fairly reactive. So what were the consequences of reactive policies? Economic, institutional, and cultural resistance, lack of willingness to acknowledge the environmental impacts and market signals, delayed transition policies, creating unsustainable lock-ins, but ultimately were unable to halt the decline. This led to massive job losses. For instance, in the UK, consumption of coal peaked in 1956. Production was peaked much earlier. During its peak, coal contributed to about 7% of national employment. But by the time of the miners' strike in 1984-85, employment was 90% below peak. Massive fall in local revenues and impact of local economy and environment. For instance, in the Appalachia region in the USA, which was very highly dependent on coal mining, sudden transitions led to massive economic impoverishment. Vast areas were polluted, damaged, and abandoned. The lack of unified regional sort of strategy planning, transition planning, was really felt in this area. And the third, acknowledging these impacts and assessing them has also come decades afterwards, delaying, in a sense, the kind of measures that could be taken to address challenges. So in stark contrast to historical examples, which were mainly driven by market forces, we know that today's imperatives to rapidly cut emissions is driven by a global political consensus formalized in the Paris Agreement. For this reason, no historical example can provide a coherent framework for the upcoming unprecedented transitions, but they can, however, provide insights into a well-managed transition and warn of the consequences of undermanaging such a transition, namely political instability, economic deterioration, social pushback, and weakened trust in institutions. While this has been the case, and there are experiments taking place on transition planning across the globe, where we see examples from South Africa, examples of transition funds from Chungnam in South Korea, and of course, transition planning at a local level in Colorado. Very few countries have implemented or initiated transition policy. So what would be the 5 broad recommendations looking at the past examples and some of the present experiences? First, setting out a phase-out timeline and pathway. that is ambitious, but the government needs to be ready for the exit to happen even faster. We need both top-down ambition setting and facilitative frameworks, but very importantly, also need to have a bottom-up decision-making process, making regions central to transition planning and using participatory process can really help in developing robust plans. Third, investing in clean energy to avoid lock-ins and investing in local capacities. This requires local transition plans, and I will keep coming back to this through the talk. Transitions without alternatives will leave workers, communities, and regions impoverished. So a phase in is required for phase out to take place in a sustainable manner. Fourth, combining increased ambition with targeted and sufficient transition support. And the support is financial, technical, and in capabilities of governance institutions or creating new governance institutions. And fifth, more importantly, this entire process needs to be iterative and flexible that accounts for changing ground realities. So all of this sort of can also be sort of concisely said that a just transition process is what we need. I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I just love the way you've put it that for a phase down or a phase out, a phase in is equally important. And the idea, therefore, is that this is not just about industrial policy, although industrial policy plays a very important role. There is a huge role that people have to play. And you've, in some senses, shared with us so many cautionary tales about when there's been transition in industries in other countries, people have been affected. And all of them have been affected, or most of them have been affected badly. And in this context, then, the need for a just transition, in the context of India, which is, very, very coal dependent, becomes very important. And I know, Simran, you have worked quite a bit in this area, and, maybe let's hear from you what you think about what kind of governance mechanisms would be there, would kind of enable this process to happen, right? Because India has huge structural inequalities. And keeping those structural inequalities in mind, you talk about the role of procedural justice in addition to policy to make a difference. So can you kind of talk about policies, initiatives that promote inclusivity and equity among disadvantaged and marginalized communities? And in this context, talk about how justice, procedural justice, plays a role.
Thank you.
Simran, just one more second. Sorry about that. Just to remind the audience that please go ahead and put up your questions in the question and answer box or in the chat window. And, that's how we will take our discussion forward. Simran, go ahead.
Right. Thanks, Saruna, for the invite and for the opportunity to discuss my chapter. And it's a pleasure following Madhura. I think she's profoundly sort of summed up together everything, all the conceptual framework which needs to be integrated in a just governance framework. So let me allow to bring some of our experience in the context and maybe ground it a little bit, right? Energy transition is, of course, complex. It's a technical transition at a large scale, but also impacting industries, lives, livelihoods at a much deeper level, right? So in that context, how do we understand justice? And in the Indian context, I think you aptly pointed out our inherent inequalities, disparities in the society. So before we really speak about justice, I think the important point is to recognize it, right? How do we understand and recognize, and what transformative goals do we strive for, which are practical delta improvements over the current status? Let me give you an example, how very difficult it is to define a sort of a singular or a binary definition of justice in the context. I don't work much in coal space, coal mining as much, which can be far more complex. We have a little experience in electricity generation, right? And over the years, increasing contractualization, allied industries, which are a lot of informal workers working in, I think, very, very pathetic conditions, especially, for example, ash picking industries, etc. But even the formal space of, electricity generation, we have contractual workers, skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled. Take a case of an unskilled worker working in a coal yard, probably in late 50s, having respiratory issues, skin issues, weakening eyesight, and he will not report that despite available medical facilities, because the day he reports that, he will be shown the door and will not be asked to come next day because of the possibility of accidents, of course. And such is the state of our of a larger industries. And when we talk of, I think, just transition or fair transition, we can't really be limited to energy transition alone, because the issues of rights, dignity of work, dignity of workers, fair and living wages cuts across sectors, right? So that's those, and these are issues that we need to recognize and reflect on at individual level, perhaps, but definitely at a society level as well as systems level. What kind of society and system do we transform for? Transition becomes extremely important because vulnerabilities can lead to multi-generational impact on education, health, development indices. There have been known cases where climate impacts have led people to force sex work and displacement. So it is a serious human issue more than anything else. Right. So once we, I think, begin to recognize, I think social dialogue plays an important role. ILO advocates, and it's deeply sort of inbuilt our Indian constitution to really build that sensitivity, build the kind of systems, procedural justice, etc. Which can be inclusive and participative. I think social dialogues plays a very, very important role to build the empathy and to really bring forth the voice of people who are really impacted and being left out in the process. This can't happen at the city level and the corporate offices, unfortunately. And although social dialogue is very, very sort of inherent to our culture, I think we fail to assimilate in our institutions, right? So in terms of procedural justice, of course, I think I'll begin with, I think dialogue is extremely important. And then, of course, there's a lot that gets done, including decentralization, inclusion of impacted people, empowerment of workforce. And I will quickly come to your request on the policies which have empowered communities and what we can learn from that in the interest of time, right? So there are quite a few. I was struggling to find a good answer initially, but to reflect on it, I think, and I'll borrow the words of Nikhil Dev from Mazdoor Kisan Seva Sansthan. He very beautifully articulates NREGA as one of the largest carbon abatement and climate resilience program across the globe, right? Check dams, water conservation efforts, trees being planted, forests being planted, reforestation, soil treatment, non-concrete roads. So and empowers community by ensuring them 100 days of minimum wage, and Rajasthan, of course, has taken some steps to increase the number of days to 150, if I'm not wrong, right? And that's a paradigm shift that is needed to not look at these programs as freebies. This is essential asset building work, which does not just empower communities but also has a positive climate impact. And again, at very minimal wages, performance of workers being closely monitored. I, as a professional of my organization, I am entitled to much social security, paid leaves, which is not the case for NREGA workers. So we need to relook at some of the fundamental things, but there's a lot more that we done. I think FRA, Forest Rights Act, was a radical legislative decision, which still stands only minimally implemented. At the state level, we see continuous expansion of right to health, which has been in the debate recently in the state of Rajasthan. I think all this empowers communities, increase the capability of communities and individuals to negotiate and ensure that they're not vulnerable enough, vulnerable that they will have to fall back to forced work, which can be detrimental in multiple ways, not just health and mental well-being, but to dignity of the individual itself. So I'll stop at that. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that, Simran. I mean, you've given us examples of policies which you feel are in the right direction and so on. And Vinuta, I will then ask you, how would you respond to Simran? Do you think we are doing enough? How, in this discourse around energy transition, is the voice of the community being heard? And how important is it for the voice of the community to be heard, right? How would it help? What's the point of engaging with the marginalized community that is dependent on coal, for example? You have a lot of experience in this. You've both from Jharkhand and Kerala and so on this. So, can you give us two things? On one end, to see, are we doing enough? And on the other, why do we need to do more?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Runa. Thanks to IIST and IIMC for organizing this and bringing together this vast sort of experience and understanding on this really important transition that is underway. Also, thanks to Madhura and Simran to have set the sort of base on which I can build. So thank you very much for that. I just wanted to say that, the short response quite clearly is that we are not doing enough at all in terms of engaging the people who are going to be impacted by the transition. There is a lot of work to be done on that front. And it is essential for the transition to actually happen in a way that is, I think, both just but also sensitive to the needs of the community. So I'd like to build on this a little bit. One of the things that ASER did along with the Policy and Development Advisory Group based out of Jharkhand was to organize conversations, focus group discussions, and ultimately a sort of a conference of panchayats that actually looked at the energy transition and what it meant for the panchayat leader, for the mukhya, for various people engaged in local governance issues. And we realized that the language also needs to be different. So we needed to ask and have the dialogue in a language that made sense from the ground, which may not necessarily be the same jargon that's used in the policy spaces. So through the entire process, it was also definitely both a learning and unlearning experience for us as well as we engaged in these conversations. But I think the reason I would go back for that to be a really important conversation, I think Madhura spoke about examples where when society is not engaged in the process of transition and society starts losing confidence in the institutions, then there's actually pushback, and ultimately politics is downstream of culture. And so as if society isn't going to create a sort of an open space for this transition to actually be enabled, then there is going to be pushback, and then politics will respond in the way that they need to respond to ensure that people's voices are being heard. So I think people will get their voices heard, but if we are to have that conversation in a constructive manner, then it needs to start early. It needs to be definitely a process of dialogue. So it is not a one-way conversation of putting out a plan and saying, okay, now how can we roll this out, but actually asking and trying to gain both knowledge and understanding from the ground on how to get this going. So I think extremely important, as Simran said, is social dialogue. I think the heartening part for us from the conversations were that we did not necessarily hear opposition. We definitely heard from people how deeply entrenched their lives were with the coal economy and with the sort of political economy of coal, whether they were directly employed or whether they were part of the sort of value chain, or whether they were in other ways eking out a living in some way related to coal. At the same time, we also heard from the communities who have been oftentimes displaced more than once by coal. So it's possible that, people have lost their homes to the mine itself, and then possibly to the overburden of the mine, and the overburdens keep growing as well. So it is definitely a community that's not necessarily only directly involved in coal. They're also impacted by coal, but they definitely see it as a huge part of their lives and livelihoods. So we definitely heard people speaking about health impacts, speaking about displacement, speaking about the importance of forests and water in their life, and how, coal has impacted their access to clean water. There is a sense that, we are dependent on the industry in some ways to provide education, health, etc. But not always on the ground did we see that actually in, that the hospitals and schools were actually in place helping people. We also saw that it was affecting agriculture. So there is a sort of a tension that exists, but at the same time, there's a huge dependence. And like I said, I think where I draw sort of hope from was that they all spoke about the importance of Jal Jangal Jameen. And they all said, for example, that water was so essential to them. They spoke about Manrega and how that scheme needs to be utilized. They spoke about the district mineral funds and how that can be utilized to benefit them and for skill development. The other thing I think that came up from the conversations was also the fragmentation of the way in which policy necessarily approaches the problem. So, Manrega could well be thought of as a scheme that is enabling this transition, but it's thought of as a livelihood scheme. So how can we start also sort of coalescing various goals which are in some way leading in the same direction, but more consciously, because then we would do the kind of interventions that would address multiple needs rather than one need. So how can Manrega become far more sort of clear about how it's ensuring, let's say, forest protection or water source protection, and be much more conscious about doing that, as well as, say, generating new livelihoods. And maybe one last thing that I would like to close with is that when we think about the energy transition, we forget that these other transitions are happening simultaneously, and that renewable energy is but one component of this transition. So yes, there is, the phase in on the energy front of renewable energy, but there needs to be the phase in of so many more things as we discuss this transition. And I'd like to sort of stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Absolutely, Madhura. I think that's, Vinuta, I think that's exactly what Madhura was getting at when she talked about the phase in, that it's a much, much bigger, a problem, if you will, that we have to look at. But what Madhura also did was, by telling us that, we are now breaching that 1.5 degree mark, remind us of the urgency of the problem. And one of our audience members have therefore asked, well, should we speed things up? Should India speed things up? And in that context, if I could ask Shaun, what does our understanding of industrial policy tell us? Is there a win-win? Are there opportunities where we can go for an energy transition and at the same time society as a whole will not lose out? And perhaps if there are, then we could think about speeding up or moving our policies in that direction. Shaun, any comments or thoughts on that?
Sure. So basically, in the past, when we've had this conversation, what was not there was discussion of that on, the losers, the communities that will be impacted because of the transition. Since we have this in the conversation right now, it needs to be amplified. So there are, in fact, there are two things that industrial policy actually, there are two sort of tests that need to be sort of checked for, that the support that the sector is getting, with that support, can it then survive when it is unsupported to compete globally? And of course, and the other one is that, the total cost of the support has to be outweighed by the present discounted value of the benefits. Now, what is not there in the conversation is the stakeholders are losing out or not benefiting. And there is, of course, necessity to bring those people, as Binuta mentioned, into the conversation. And of course, I mean, we've seen that there are some countries which have announced their JETPs. But I think that this is just the starting point for that, and not enough. We haven't made enough progress taking everything into account and moving forward.
Simran, do you want to weigh in on this as well?
Sure, thanks, Una. In power sector, we have something called energy trilemma, right? We have to balance the needs of energy security, reliability, affordability, and sustainability. I think in the larger energy transition context, also there are need for growth, development, and sustainability. Right. So I'll reframe the question. Right. Is what we are doing is it the best that we can possibly do? Right. And there the answer lies no. This is not the best. There are many systemic inefficiencies, lack of transparency and accountability in what we are doing. The goals of transition are very ad hoc, not in line with the development policy, often with the needs of the people, both in terms of not just climate justice but energy justice also, right? So I think the question needs to be reframed. There needs to be at the governance level transparency on how we are balancing objectively different needs of development, growth, and sustainability, right? And perhaps we can move towards the best that we can do.
Great. I think this whole need for dialogue, this whole need for consensus building, transparency, comprehensive planning seems to be almost a cornerstone for a just energy transition. So in that context, Madhura, how can the government encourage such inclusive dialogue and collaboration across various groups? And what is the role for international cooperation in supporting India's efforts at this?
Thanks so much, Runa. I just want to also highlight that just transition planning in all the experiences that we have seen so far, however imperfect they've been, has shown that it takes decades to get something right or marginally right. We know now about South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The entire stakeholder engagement dialogue process in South Africa started more than 15 years back. It's almost in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, where labor unions started engaging with the government to sort of to talk about just transitions and what it means in the context of the region, Mpumalanga, but also in the context of what it means in South Africa. And the JETP conversations was just the final sort of layer. There is a whole lot more that needs to happen, but it was the final layer built on a very robust domestic process that was ongoing for a very long time. And even in the case of, say, Germany, Ruhr, we've seen that it took them more than 40 years, 50 years to get it right. It's often used as an example of transitions done fairly well, but the first 2 decades were very reactive and were not successful. It took them course correction and iterative policy framing, developing more sort of platforms and governance structures to make it into an alternative education-based sort of shift from essentially hard coal dependence to an education-based economy. So what I would sort of, one line from the OECD Just Transition report that really struck with me is that the absence of appropriate government policies, funds, and structures for just transitions make it difficult for workers, communities, employers to move forward on their own. Without sort of assertive, coherent action from the government, we risk seeing many more examples of transitions that do not deliver justice, and result in stranded communities. So just looking at the experiences, some of the five, I would sort of say that there are 5 broad framing questions that are needed to be answered as we start with stakeholder engagements as well. Who will be impacted? That's really critical. What will the scale of impacts look like across different sectors, economic capacities, people, etc.? How do you fund the transitions? How do you govern the transitions? And this might actually also mean creating new structures and platforms that may not exist at the moment for enabling participatory mechanisms. And the 5th one is, then who are the stakeholders and how do you sort of get them involved in a process that's bottom up and iterative and will take a long time? And how do you sort of keep them engaged? So just on to sort of help with these questions, international collaborations, as well as a lot of domestic effort would be needed for building evidence on the scale of the impacts. We know that in India it's going to be massive. Estimates really vary. We don't have an exact figure of the workers directly and indirectly impacted by the coal value chain. It ranges from anywhere between 4 million to 13 million, depending upon what's included, what's not. And the informality of the sector compounds the challenge. And this is where both domestic resources and international resources can support accelerating investments in capacities and governance structures. This is community, local, regional, and national capacities. And capacities, by capacities, I also mean creating sort of teach-ins as well as hiring people to be able to do this. Our local bodies are already overworked, and this would be new additional assets needed. Knowledge networks and technical assistance from international actors, as well as experiences of domestic examples that are taking place. For instance, Jharkhand has started a Just Transition Task Force. What is their examples and how can it sort of help with transition planning in other states? And we also have international knowledge networks such as the Powering Past Coal Alliance that can help provide access to other regions who are also grappling with similar but different challenges. Massive scale up in finance and conversations on how do we mobilize private finance, leverage public finance, both domestic and international finance, and multi-level transition planning, which will span basically regions. So these would be a few things that we could learn that we could sort of collaborate with, both within domestic participants, but as well as with international stakeholders to support just transitions in the country.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Madhura. Vinuta, I would like you to add to this discussion from the point of view of your experience working with the panchayats members themselves. So, clearly you have to empower political leadership in Gram Panchayats to effectively contribute to these challenges, right? What measures can be taken to do this? And, as you are addressing the question, perhaps we'd be able to address the question that I think Joydeep has asked about how coal energy issues in West Bengal could be resolved for some of the belts like the Deocha Pachimi belt. What are your experiences in looking at this? And also maybe at the same time, since we mentioned it's not just energy transitions, just transitions means much more. Perhaps you could also throw some light on that during your discussion.
So I think I'd also like to start by sort of going back to that 1.5 degree question, which came up a lot in the conversations at the panchayat level, because they are already seeing the impacts of the climate crisis, whether it's food security, migration, the impact of migration on women and children. So they're already experiencing that. So what that does is that they are actually thinking of this process both as resilience building for the future and also as a transition. So I think the sort of conscious acknowledgement that things are changing in very quick and sort of terms that are making life difficult is already a lived experience. And from that lived experience, at least in the coal mining belt, we definitely see an openness to talk about how to build resilience for their futures. And so I think that the process of the transition is also about the process of building community resilience. And that opens up a much more positive and constructive space for dialogue. So I would say that equipping panchayats to both understand that this transition is underway and how they can think about this transition, as well as equipping them into processes for building resilience, because there is a huge overlay in terms of what solutions we would look for when we are talking about that transition. So I think that if we also look at it from the lens of resilience building, then we are actually looking at co-benefits of both the transition as well as building for livelihoods for the future. And if that were to happen and there was a coalescing of the various schemes which already have money. So one of the interesting things was we never heard from the ground money being an issue. It felt even the panchayat leaders or the district administration, they were always talking about, we have these funds which we could better utilize. So it was probably a more practical, pragmatic approach, not in any way to say that this doesn't require huge amounts of fund flow. So I think that's absolutely essential and necessary, but also acknowledging that from the ground, the sort of pragmatism allows for looking at what is available and utilizing that better in looking at the future. And I don't think I think we should not forget the possibility and the potential of re-engineering how those funds that are available are used. There are, huge amounts of district mineral funds, Manrega, ensuring that forest rights are properly implemented, ensuring Campa funds are properly used, ensuring the water. So there is a need to also coalesce around that. I'm sorry, I don't know enough about the West Bengal case. I wouldn't like to talk about that, but I think that ground up, we need to be thinking about solutions, we need to be thinking about resilience, and we need to bring communities together in that process of building for the future.
That is such a positive outlook to recognize that, like you said before, it's not that people are resistant to a transition, but they are looking at how one would go about it. I see in the question and answers that there are a lot of concerns about the finance and investment related issues. And I'd like to make a pitch for our last webinar, which would happen on the 17th of August, which actually deals with investments and financial inflows for energy transition. So I invite all of you who have questions on that to actually attend that webinar, and you'd get to know more. I see a very interesting question by Shayantan Chaudhary, and I'll read this out. Shaun will address it to you to start with, because he talks about rent seeking. And rent seeking was one of the biggest, if you will, criticisms for using industrial policy as a mechanism for development. So I'll just read out Shayantan's question and I'll throw it open to Shaun, but of course, any of the other panelists can also talk about it. Shayantan says that climate crisis and rent-seeking prospects and even national security might make a suitable case for just transition to many. What similar moral, social, economic imperatives or narratives could make a case for similar transition in justice, governance, social security, and public policy for different social groups of people, so that the gains from just transitions are not just restricted to the socioeconomic elites? So we are talking, we've been talking about how the marginalized community becomes very, very important when looking at transition. But, how would you want to address this question, Shaun?
Right. So I'm not the best person to answer this, but I'll take a shot at it. So I think, the discussion that is the most critical, that includes dialogue. Because ultimately, the only way in which it is well known that there is going to be rent seeking, and that is the whole objection to use of industrial policy. Now, how do you prevent that? Now, the only way in which it can be prevented is that the processes that are adopted, they are transparent and inclusive. And the only way that can be done is through participatory processes, which the rest of the panel have all been talking about, how to make it more inclusive and participatory. Others can.
All right, I think Sean's connection has a little bit of a problem. Would anybody else want to pitch in with their thoughts on this? How do we ensure that the marginalized communities have access, for example, to huge transition funds?
If I can come in, am I audible?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Well, honestly, I'm also at a loss, right? I don't see a strong driver to ensure that justice happens, right? For me, I think justice is especially in a democratic country, a manifestation of consciousness of people, society, and systems, right? So all of need to evolve, and I think there has to be a political shift in how we look at development, how we look at growth, etc., how we look at sustainability, inclusivity, participation. There are no functional examples of at least institutional participation of governance in the country. There are, yes, isolated examples of decentralized inclusive participation. Vinuta can speak about it. There's an example of Ivre Bazaar on how much sort of transformative change it can bring, right? But I think this is participation and democracy is something evolving process, and I think unless we seed it, foster it, and believe it won't happen, right? The paradigm and the trends have been completely opposited in terms of contractualization of workers to next and sort of limitation of rights to an extent now where socially, at least in the intellectual circles, collective bargaining by unions is looked down upon, right? So that's the reality of our society right now. And there has to be a shift for not just inclusivity and human rights, etc., but I think from a political and national perspective, there is a deep sense of security and stability of the country is also at risk, especially in coal mining areas.
Yeah, thank you. Madhura, you have something to add?
Just a couple of things. I completely agree with everything that Simran has said, but I just wanted to add two additional points, more to substantiate what he was also saying, that one of the reasons I feel that just transition has become such a critical issue, not just in India, but also globally, is because we've seen over the past several decades that inequality has been rising, and we see that in the Indian context, and the development benefits of large infrastructure has not really translated into support for the local communities. And because they have lost out in the past so many times, as Vinuta's examples have also highlighted, the attempt at least is that when we know there is a transition taking place and we need to do this, to do it in a manner that will try and minimize to the extent possible the impacts on the communities, and use it as sort of an impulse to think about a world where there is little more distributional justice than what we have seen so far in the past. And the motivations for change or action may vary. We heard that in the context of Jharkhand, one of the reasons why they started looking at just transition task force as well was because of the projected rise in lawlessness because of large-scale job losses, unplanned job losses should it take place. The motivations could be different, but as long as they sort of lead to a serious consideration of the position, the pathway that we want to take, and reforms in governance structures, I think it'll be useful to think about.
So if we are talking about reforms in governance structures, what kind of reforms would you think of just off the top of your head that could be implemented relatively easily, keeping in mind the political economy of the country? Any ideas?
I'm not sure.
I think I'd just like to make one point on that, which is much more local, so I'm coming at it ground up. I think the district administration has a significant role to play in this transition. And I think that we need to see how they can be further strengthened and institutional capacity can be built in to enable district administrations to be part of this transition. We are seeing climate planning happening at the district level in some states in India. I definitely think that this transition piece should also be included in the climate planning that's happening at the district level. And there needs to be a lot more support at that level, I think, for this kind of planning. They've been also the implementers of so many schemes on the ground that they have a very good understanding of what's working and what's not working. So how we can utilize that brain trust as well as that connection to the ground, I think is very important, and how we can institutionalize that in this process would be quite critical.
So Vinuta, just to kind of ask you a little more, the district administration is usually from the higher socioeconomic strata, right? Now, to what extent are they actually taking in inputs of the marginalized in taking their plans forward? What has your experience been?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, they have also not done enough. I mean, it's very clear that across all of the many sort of attempts to ensure that people who have been marginalized, whether it's gender or it's scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, or we've definitely seen that their voice has not been heard. And it is not merely about giving them a token seat at a table, but about ensuring that they have the space to actually express their opinions in those meetings, or in creating safe spaces in which they can express their opinions. So I think definitely there's a lot to be done, even even below at the level of elected government, panchayats. There's a lot of work to be done. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of effort needs to be put in that space, and not enough is happening. Even in a state like Jharkhand, which has a task force, even there, not enough is being done to ensure that the voices from the ground are being heard.
And yet it is the voices from the ground, or the people from the ground, that will ensure that a transition happens. So it has to start from there. Shaun, you had something to add. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Just one thing that I thought I should add at this point is that, institutionally, one thing that we could leverage on is the whole digitalization that is happening in the country, and using that to reach the, sort of last mile. It basically builds up on the Aadhaar Jam Trinity that is already there in place, but it can be, can be made more inclusive and more participatory.
Right. So to address the question that we have, which is whether it would be feasible for India to actually speed up its energy transition, given its diverse energy resources and the large population employed indirectly or directly with fossil fuel, what do you, or how positive or not positive do you feel about it? How feasible is it, in your opinion, coming from your points of view? Madhura?
Thanks so much. I would sort of answer this in a few different ways. 2070 is really far away, right? It's almost 50 years back, 50 years into the future. And a lot. But what that net zero goal essentially has told us now, and has been really helpful, is that the direction of travel is that we are going to look at reducing our emissions and go towards net zero. It's a national goal. How does that translate into different sectors? What does it mean for different states? While nationally it's 2070, you might have different states aiming for reaching it much sooner, so that there is space for the states that are not that developed to get to reach the net zero goal by a certain timeline. So you've seen in the past states like Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra make commitments to reach net zero by 2050 or thereabouts. Now the question is, what are the pathways that we are looking at? A low ambition pathway, a medium BAU pathway, and a future pathway of that net zero 2070 goal. How often are we going to revisit whether that 2070 still makes sense in the light of economic, market signals, environment and climate signals? And also to sort of go back to what Simran had said earlier, are we using right now the best available resources and making the best possible efforts to accelerate transitions? In a way, I would say that clean energy transitions are also from a justice perspective, because otherwise you are making communities and people dependent on technologies of the past and almost in sunset sectors, and even from a national sort of economic perspective. So let's forget the 2070s, the 2050s, 60s conversation, because that's far into the future. But let's look at what can be done right now. And are we putting in those enabling frameworks that can help us in making the most of the clean energy goals and transitions that are needed? This will be starting with governance frameworks, because just transitions will take, getting it right or making plans will take decades. Whether the coal phase out, phase down happens in the 40s or 50s, planning needs to start now. Second, look at ways in which we can avoid future lock-ins. If that means stopping investments in areas in fossil technologies where we know that cheaper alternatives, economically viable alternatives exist, then we need to sort of make that shifts. And what are some of the slightly more painful decisions that may need to be taken right now for economic, social, and financial benefits in the medium term? And also sort of looking at assessing, does it still make sense from an energy security, economic security perspective to continue reliance on fossil technologies when you have market competitiveness in other areas? So I'd sort of look at it in that sense, that does it make sense for India to transition faster? I think in certain sectors, maybe it makes more economic and social sense for us to accelerate our goals. But it first begins with translating what the 2070 means under different scenarios for different sectors. And
Absolutely, yes. Knowing the pathways going forward. Would anybody else want to also comment on how they feel about how feasible? I see Simran is all set.
Yeah, I'll just make a small comment. I think, see, the energy transition, especially since it's a sort of also infrastructure transition in capitalism, it's going to come at a cost. Globally, the trend in Australia, US, Europe says that it has a significant impact on retail electricity tariffs, right? But I think in the current power sector context of the country, and I'm just talking about that, this may apply to other industrial contexts also, right? There are deep systemic inefficiencies from planning to execution processes, subsidies, how money is distributed, etc. Right? If we just address those, not will only we abate tons of CO2 without any investment, right? We will unlock enough money for transition. So there's hope, and I think it will deliver a lot of social goals, development goals, large scale global competitiveness for our industries, since energy is key input, etc. So there's definitely hope. Right? Are we in the right direction? I think we are not there yet. We are in the direction of adding renewable energy capacity, not transitioning away from coal. We experience as subnational players that at the identities of key decision makers, functionaries beyond the national discourse of net zero, etc. And the agencies is deeply entrenched in coal. They are not able to envisage a new future. To the extent where we see, I'll just give an example, flexible technologies such as energy storage, batteries, and treat it as a round-the-clock reliable supply of power, restructure of contracts. Similarly, fashion PPAs with thermal power plants. So such is the deep entrenchment in coal that I think we are, just reaccelerating our own efforts and that we're putting in.
Great. Vinuta, you were making some very interesting comments on, why speeding up is a good idea, but there are challenges in the context of the political economy. Perhaps you could share it with everybody.
Yeah, sure. I feel that I think as we are seeing the effects of climate change, whether it's on agricultural produce, the further sort of alienation of people from their livelihoods. We heard very recently in Jharkhand that migration is becoming more severe. And unfortunately, it's the elderly and children who are being left behind, which is then having further implications on their own security. So I think we're beginning to see social distress of the kind we have possibly not necessarily witnessed in the recent decades. And I think this is going to make it harder for people to come together and build something constructive. So it needs interventions and it needs support. And the sooner I think we see the importance of addressing adaptation and resilience building in the climate framework, I think we will see that the transition becomes, like Madhura said, inevitable. Yes, it is already being seen as inevitable because of the target set, but it will also be seen as socially inevitable and almost absolutely necessary to ensure that people live dignified lives in the future. So I think if we actually see that we are left with fewer and fewer choices, but to do this in order to deliver development and possibly even growth for those people, then I think we will start moving in the direction of the transition. It will not be because of our international positions, but it will be actually because that's the way we can deliver a better future for our people.
So you're saying that, our backs are towards the wall already, and that is the reality of it all. And in that context, having the right kind of pathways become absolutely critical, no matter whether 2070 or what we are looking at, right? In this context, somebody mentioned the loss and damage funds. Now, where or how could India leverage a loss and damage fund in the context of energy transitions or just energy transitions? Any ideas? Or is loss and damage for a slightly different as compared to what we are looking at in the context of transition? Madhura seems to think it is different, as do I, but do you want to elaborate?
Very briefly, maybe also not the best person to talk about this, but I think loss and damage perhaps may not be the right sort of one to look at when we're looking at energy transitions. There are conversations around a lot of other climate finance funds that will help with the energy transitions that we are talking about. May not be only sufficient for that, but loss and damage would be particularly for countries that are facing the climate impacts and destructions because of that. And also at the moment, the fund is not very well capitalized. It's a small amount of money. And for a country the size of India, I don't think that that's something that we should even look at as an option. Look at the domestic resources that we can mobilize itself, in addition to the larger climate resources, climate finance resources that are spoken.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. It's almost time for us to end, but any closing thoughts for any of you? Just short statements. Yeah, Simran, go ahead.
Quick comments. I think the understanding of justice will evolve once we engage in a social dialogue, right? And the processes, the institutions will possibly, if we allow it to foster, will evolve accordingly. Participation, democracy, what does it really mean in practice? Is an experience. It's an evolutionary process. It's not a binary idea that you frame the rules and it will happen, right? And that will take time, and transition is happening right now. So I think while we also strive for that, a rights-based approach is critical, and an exhaustive rights-based framework is already deep, profoundly covered in our constitution. right? Now the challenge for the civil society and the polity is to how do we guarantee and deliver rights?
True. And just there was a question about the latest policies and strategies in SECI for climate change issues for West Bengal. Well, SECI doesn't necessarily do things very specifically state-wise, and I would urge you therefore to read the chapter that Shubham and Raghav have written, because they have specifically focused on every single policy and the state of play of policy in each. So yes, so with this, I guess I will hand over the stage to Vibhuti, who will maybe do the difficult task of trying to wrap up our conversation with some closing comments and some outcomes of what this webinar has produced for us.
Thanks. Very enriching discussion, and a lot was discussed today. So I'll try and summarize it. But firstly, congratulations to IIM Calcutta and IIST for this mammoth task of getting so many experts together and working on this very topical issue of helping coal-rich states to prepare for energy transition in a just and equitable manner. Today's discussion was more focused on institutional governance and the role of state. So to kind of begin with, Sean talked about examples of tools for planners in developing and the developed world. She provided overview of some of the goods and the bads of the industrial policy. She did emphasize the role that of state is very, very critical, how in addressing the problems associated with the market failures and the ways it can help to address it. France and Japan and South Korea examples were mentioned. The new focus, however, is on the green industrial policy, which kind of requires more careful attention to promote decarbonization effort. She did mention about few examples of successful examples of solar PV in China, where renewable energy in China, as well as the electric mobility in China has been taken to such a big scale. Apart from that, Brazil on the solar thermal panel, as well as the ethanol policy, where there's a big push. India, there's a prominent success story of CNG for daily autos, as well as now we are increasingly seeing the success of the wind turbines, as well as the EV transition. She did highlight two criticisms of industrial policy that needs to be addressed, which was on the information asymmetry as well as the production. From there, we moved on to international experience in the context of decarbonization, how different countries have moved forward in this energy transition phase, where Madhura talked about how this is now energy transition is inevitable. World is likely to breach the threshold by 2027. So we need immediate action as the world is facing the consequences. Even now with Europe experiencing heat waves, and we are seeing a lot of floods in India as an example. IPCC scenario points out that the coal is or should decline, even gas as well as oil too should decline. But while we are seeing those trends, but it needs to happen at a much, much faster pace. For coal, since Paris Agreement, we did see coal pipeline has shrunk by 72%, but again, it's not enough still. And the consequences of real impact on this transition, which were not kind of factored, in this whole process in the last few decades, have how the lack of willingness to impact the social impact, as well as how it can lead to massive job losses, massive fall in local revenue and impact on economy, economic impoverishment, and how also the impacts on the pollution. So while there have been a lot of impact that were not factored in, so that kind of creates a space for a better framework to be created. How these impacts can be driven by market forces, but the framework can consider coherent impact for energy transition, which, like for a phase down or a phase out, simply we can't move to a phase down or a phase out approach, but phase in is also very, very important. Few examples she mentioned was on South Africa, Colorado as well. She did set out 5 broad recommendations, which were setting out a phase-out timeline or a pathway, looking at top-down ambition setting, but also including a bottom-up approach, using region central for planning, investing in clean energy to avoid lock-in, and investing in local capacity as well. Transitioning without alternatives will leave people impoverished. So there needs to need for creating governance institutions. Also, process needs to be iterative to account for ground reality. She also did highlighted that we will need a lot of domestic as well as international collaborations to address these issues as well, whether it is to understand the impact, whether it's need for technical and financial support for this transition. So using of these international knowledge network like powering Past Coal Alliance to learn other countries' experience and leveraging these institutions to leverage more private and public finance as well as domestic and international capital. Then Simran did talked about the inequalities and disparity in the society. How do we understand those disparities, identify those becomes very critical. So there's no singular or binary definition, becomes very, very difficult. Coal mining can be more complex with a lot more informal worker. But even in coal energy generation, contractual worker is very, very prominent. So they are suffering and they do have an impact on health. But he highlighted that, they are not able to even report as they will be shown the doors. So such is the state of our industry. So we need to consider issues at the individual as well as society level. Transition becomes important and it can impact multi-generation. It is a serious human issue. Social dialogue, which was again emphasized by even Madhura and Vinuta, that plays an important role to build the empathy and bring forward the voice of people who are actually impacted. He also mentioned about the empowerment of workforce, so policies that have improved and empowered people. He cited Menrega as a scheme, which is kind of regarded as a successful climate resilience program as well across the globe. So which had elements of, concrete roads, afforestation, while also emphasizing on the minimum wage. So there is a paradigm shift. It has positive climate impact too. So at the state level, we are also seeing discussion and debate on right to health, like in the case of Rajasthan, becoming more prominent, but not all the states are doing that. So so that was from Simran. Then Vinuta did discuss about the voice of community being very relevant and how important it is. And the question whether are we doing enough and why do we need more? So not very encouraging to hear, but the response was that we are not doing enough for people impacted by this transition. It is essential and we need to do a lot more, which is not only just, but also sensitive to the needs of the community. Asar in Jharkhand had organized a focus group discussion wherein based on the discussion, there was emphasis on engagement in the issue of local governance. Their assessment was that there will be a lot of pushback if the policy does not include the voices of the people who are impacted. It needs to start early and the process of dialogue needs to be built in. So the issue of social dialogue was reflected and also kind of highlighted how people are deeply drenched with coal economy and often displaced more than once because of coal. So it's not just one-time impact, but they have been suffering over the course of time. There was a hope of Ghar Jungle and Zameen, which we talked about, and also kind of highlighted how the use of district mineral fund that can be used for skill development, while scheme like Menrega, which is a livelihood scheme, but has one particular goal, but how these schemes can be made more cohesive, which addresses multiple needs and not just one need. So when we think about energy transition, I think there was this consensus on that we kind of forget about how this transition is happening simultaneously. So there's a need not only to phase in renewable energy, but phase in many more other things. So we also discussed about rent seeking, reforms in the governance structure that could be implemented. There was also discussion on how to, on the net zero pathway, which can be different for states, for different sectors. But the idea is that the transition is inevitable and we need to accelerate it in a much faster way. Just to sum up, so there is an urgency of problem, and definitely not only India, but the world needs to speed things up, but it needs to factor in the needs of people and stakeholders who are actually impacted and include them at the designing phase of policies and frameworks. So the importance of policy of framework in addressing those schemes and the multiple needs was highlighted. The relevance of social dialogue and building coherence is at the center. Madhura also talked about South Africa, how this dialogue started 15 years ago, and in Germany it took them 40 to 50 years to get things right. So I think it's a long journey, but we need to get the elements right. So we need a lot of collaboration as well to make things happen right. So that's a kind of, I've tried to summarize a lot that was discussed today. Over to you, Runa.
Thank you so much. I think that was, brilliant. You just brought everything together. Thank you so much for that, Vibhuti. And thank you to all the participants who stayed all this while. Deepak has already put the link where the recording of this conversation would be available for all of you who've missed parts of it or for reference later. And I also want to remind you that we do have one more webinar on the 17th, which actually talks about a lot of the concerns that you raised today, which was on the financial aspects of an energy transition. Where will the money come from? How will it come? How will it be deployed? And so on. So thank you once again. Over to you, Deepak.
Thank you, everyone. With this, we close the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.